quite silly is the power of the people's vote. And I think the people should use it to vote for... Say it again! Let me hear it one more time!
In the last video, I talked about how our adversarial system creates a situation where it's impossible for us to approach problems from the position of, what basic assumptions can we all agree on, what do we all want to get out of this, and then develop an idea or a policy or whatever from there, and that the fractiousness and othering that creates as pollution is extremely harmful to society. In this one, I want to talk about, I think, what is the worst of all of the forms of pollution that our political system generates, namely distrust. Because it is impossible for people to trust each other if they're being lied to all the time. And so in this video, I want to talk about the lies that we are told by our political representatives, and not just some of the time, but pretty much all of the time. I mean, it is so pervasive that during political campaigns, the promises that are made, none of us take them seriously. We know that half or more of them, whatever, are going to be broken. When they're interviewed, they evade and avoid questions, part answer questions, because they don't want to tell the whole and entire truth. They lie about their affairs, they lie about their business interests, they lie about conflicts of interest. I mentioned in the previous video that in order to make themselves look as though they're doing a decent job, they will manipulate and cherry pick data. And, this is so pervasive, it goes on all the time, that we have become accustomed to it. It's become normalized for us. And so the extent to which distrust is just there in the air all the time is extraordinary. But apart from those going on all of the time, sort of low-level lies, if you want to call them that, they've told a whole bunch of whoppers over the years as well. And so I'm just going to very quickly remind you of some of the juicier ones. And please understand, it's taken me like 5 minutes of racking my brains without having to look anything up just from memory to come up with this list. And there are many, many, many more that, given a little bit of thought and a little bit of time, I could add to it. But as I've said before, I don't want to make these videos too long. So let's take a look at a few. So first of all, there was the Pentagon Papers released by the New York Times and the Washington Post back in the early 70s, which showed that the Johnson administration had, and I quote, lied extensively not only to the public but to Congress as well. Then there was the Watergate scandal, right, where Nixon's people bugged the Democratic headquarters and then lied about it. When accused of it, then lied about it and tried to cover it up. And there's a link between these two things as well, because the guy that released the Pentagon Papers, Ellsberg, I think his name was, anyway, he was originally charged with espionage and so on, and the charges were later dropped when it was found that the Nixon administration had tried to run a smear campaign on him. Then there was the Ronald Reagan, Oliver North thing, where they were illegally selling weapons to the Contras in Iran, and a similar situation in Nicaragua, where the CIA was allowing Nicaraguan drugs runners to run into the US and back again, giving them cover so that the money generated could be used to finance weapons for the Nicaraguan Contras. In his excellent film Hypernormalization, Adam Curtis charts the course of the narrative surrounding Colonel Gaddafi and how he went from vicious, brutal dictator to friend of the West and ally in the region to harbinger of terrorists, was deposed from power, chased down by CIA-funded local militia, and had a machete stuck up his arse. My personal favourite, and in pretty recent memory, is the weapons of mass destruction nonsense that took us to war in Iraq. I mean, I know much more about what happened in Britain than in the US. I do remember Colin Powell going and giving his irrefutable, rock-solid case to the UN in order to get the resolution that the US needed. But in Britain, the BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan actually came out and said these intelligence dossiers have been sexed up. They've been made to look much worse than they are in order to take us to war. He made the accusation directly, and not only did the government deny it, but they set up a whole sham inquiry, the Hutton report, which exonerated the government and damned the BBC. The Director General had to resign. Andrew Gilligan lost his job. And Andrew Gilligan's source in this story, a chap by the name of Dr. David Kelly, once the public spotlight shone on him, then he ended up killing himself. He both overdosed and slit his wrist and ended up killing himself. And so the government was responsible for all of this, not to mention the thousands of lives, both British and American soldiers, and the million or more Iraqi lives lost in the war. And as we all now know, it turns out that Andrew Gilligan's accusations were absolutely right. There was no real foundation to believe that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And this idea of whistleblowers or reporters being hounded down for exposing the lies and the crimes of their governments has been getting worse and worse and worse. Just to give a few examples, I mentioned before the Nicaragua story. The chap that exposed that was a journalist by the name of Gary Webb. And of course, the government denied it vehemently, accused him of miscasting the government as evil, and he lost his job, he lost his wife, he ended up committing suicide as a consequence of that. But of course, everything that he reported and a great deal more subsequently, with the release of papers later on, turned out to be absolutely accurate. I mean, much more recently, we have people like Edward Snowden, we have Bradley Manning, we have John Kiriakou, who exposed the torture program that the US was undergoing. Snowden, of course, exposed the surveillance of US and international citizens that the NSA is engaged in, secretly denying it.
What we do not do is spy unlawfully on Americans, or for that matter, spy indiscriminately on the citizens of any country.
And then there was Thomas Drake, who also disclosed as part of the US surveillance program. He successfully managed to defend himself, but Kiriakou went to jail. Snowden is now in exile. Chelsea Manning, I believe, is back in jail and still back in jail. And so, you know, it's extremely difficult and extremely courageous for people to come forward and expose the lies and the crimes that their governments are constantly engaging in. If we go back a little bit further in history, the US entered the First World War based on the sinking of the Lusitania and the loss of 1,000-odd American lives in that. But I mean, that situation was manipulated. Churchill knew perfectly well what was going to happen if the Lusitania sailed. The German government even posted an ad in the paper saying, if you board the Lusitania, we're going to try and sink it. So, you know, that was a manipulation and an untruth. The Second World War, the American entrance into the Second World War, was precipitated by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which again, history now shows us, or documents now show us, that the American government knew perfectly well that it was going to happen, encouraged it, in fact, and all of their really good ships had left Pearl Harbor and gone and docked elsewhere. The Vietnam War was precipitated by the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and we now know that that also didn't actually happen. And so, you know, the three biggest wars in recent memory, all three of those were precipitated, aggravated. America's entry into was caused by lies. Bald-faced, barefaced, straightforward lies. And then, of course, there was the wars on communism and then drugs and now terrorism. You know, how many lies, how many distortions, how many manipulations, how much propaganda has been told in the name of those things. And so, you know, again, I could go on and on and on and on and on. There are dozens, hundreds of these things. But the point to think about is that these are just the ones that we know about, right? God knows how many other horrific things have been done and lied about and covered up that have never been exposed. And so, you know, you've got to think, so many lies, so many crimes, all of them committed in our name, on our behalf, by people that we elected. So think about that next time you go to the polls. Thanks for listening.
The only thing that's silly is the power of the people's vote. And I think the people should use it to vote for... Say it again! Let me hear it one more time!